Okay, what we are reading in week 21 of our 2020 Bible reading is effectively the conclusion of the story of King David, at least as is told in the account of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And the plan tacks on one chapter in First Chronicles at the end of the week. But let's talk about what we see in 2nd Samuel 13 to the end of the book. Okay, two main points that we want to make or patterns that we want to see throughout these chapters, and they may in some way seem contradictory, but I think they are both there and they fit together. But the first thing we'll highlight is that what we see here is really the coming apart of David's kingdom as he is suffering the consequence of his sin with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah the Hittite. If you remember in last week's reading, that's where we closed. And he had been told by God that the sword will never depart from your house. And so all of this that takes place with Amnon and Tamar, and then Absalom's revenge on Amnon, and then Absalom conspiring to take the throne away from David, and the civil war that breaks out, and then other rebellions that take place towards the end of the book. All of that you see as a consequence of David's sin, and it's a little bit hard to know how to interpret it, but I can't help but think as I read these chapters of 2 Samuel that David is not the king that he used to be, that he doesn't show the same strength, the same leadership, and it is Joab mainly who is rebuking David for the way that he handles the Absalom situation, and Joab himself is not the most moral person in the story, but I do think we see that David does not have the same control, the same stature to reign over his own family and his own kingdom in this time of turmoil. And so past sins, maybe present weakness, all of that kind of comes together, and we see David's kingdom in many ways falling apart as we reach the conclusion of his story. But in the midst of that, I am still convinced that David can be seen in this section of the story still as a foreshadowing, as a type of Jesus, specifically in the way that he is rejected by his own and forced to flee and abandon his proper place in Jerusalem. There are some specific details in the story that are specific signs, perhaps, of what is coming later in the story of Jesus. But I think just in general, the fact that David, who is the rightful king, who is for the most part a righteous king in God's sight, is now by those closest to him and by the people of Israel generally rejected, thrown out, forced to be a fugitive in his own land. David obviously is suffering the consequence of his own failure, past and present, as we said. But Jesus goes through all of these same things and much worse, even to the point of death on the cross, not for his own sin, but for the sin of us and for the sins of the world, and is truly a righteous sufferer in that sense. So the story of David kind of comes to an end with the conclusion of the story of Absalom's rebellion, how that is put down. There's another rebellion that is put down. And what you have at the end of 2 Samuel, the last several chapters, is really what you might consider an appendix to the story. You have a psalm put in there of David. You have some other records of David's mighty men. And then you have this story at the very last chapter, the sin of the census. And this is where we read over in 1 Chronicles 21, the parallel account. Because in Chronicles, none of that stuff about Bathsheba, about Amnon, about Absalom, about any of those other things that are so tumultuous in David's reign, none of those things are mentioned. And instead, the census sin, is the chief error that is highlighted by the Chronicles writer. But we do see that story show up in both accounts, in Chronicles as his big sin, and in Samuel as one more dent against David's reputation, so to speak, as it is really the last story told about David before the story in Kings becomes really more about Solomon. So that's what we see in these chapters of Samuel and Chronicles. As always, thank you for watching whenever it is that you are watching this now or later. And I hope that you are growing in your reading discipline and knowledge of God's Word. And maybe these videos can be helpful in some way as well. So be sure to subscribe and look for the video coming out about this time next week. Thank you.